Okay, guys. It's a Tuesday morning here, and I thought I'd hop on and do a little short lecture. Excuse me, short lecture. Some interesting points on Don Quixote and another Shakespeare reading for you. Don Quixote. Just some things that were running around in my head today as I was on the discussion posts. One is, so back when I was teaching AP US history for a couple of years in China, of all places, I came across something. In the antebellum South, pre Civil War American South, right? Uh, the Southern gentlemen and ladies were obsessed with a certain author. His name was Sir Walter Scott, and he had written. He was like early 19th century, which was the antebellum South, right? And in 1819, in particular, he wrote a novel called Ivanhoe, Ivanhoe, and it was a novel about a fictional medieval knight. And Sir Walter Scott, he was British, right? But he wrote several novels about just medieval knights. And his novels were kind of like the Harlequin romances, slash Western novels of the day. They were the pulp fiction, the thrillers, right? And particularly Southern gentlemen and ladies loved reading these books because they saw in it, it kind of helped them create for themselves this image of we're royalty, we're chivalrous, we're like medieval knights. And so it built up this grand image of the antebellum South for them and made them think of themselves as like lords and ladies, so to speak, and their slaves, and the poorer Southern people were like their gentry, and they were the lords and ladies that took care of these people, right? So, kind of like in Cervantes' day, people were like reading all these novels, these fictional works about knights, and they were like, isn't this so cool? Wouldn't this world be so cool if it existed? And of course, Cervantes writes Don Quixote to kind of mock some of this stuff and mockery of some of it. Although, in the same way, in the antebellum South, people were obsessed with this British writer, Sir Walter Scott, and his knights about medieval knighthood. Um, and so it just, it struck me as kind of interesting how we can latch onto ideas and images, and then we take them and internalize ourselves, and as Cervantes put it, our brains dry up a little bit and we go a little bit crazy, like Don Quixote. I think we actually are these people, like gentlemen and ladies in the antebellum South, thought they actually were like, Ivanhoe's characters, these great medieval lords and ladies, right, that he wrote about in his stories, that Sir Walter Scott wrote about in his stories about knights. All right, so like Don Quixote is not actually that far fetched. Yeah, you can take that further and just talk about, you know, those of us who become obsessed with literature or even characters in movies to the point where we start fantasizing about them. I guess that's why people play role playing games. Um, and sometimes get so caught up in those games that they're not really part of the real world anymore. Uh, so some things to think about, like, is Don Quixote that far fetched? Or what are modern parallels to him? Another thing this made me think about is, so the medieval knights, like kind of the Sir Gawain image, uh, arguably that never existed. Arguably, you never had knights errant who went around rescuing damsels in distress, and stuff. Um, but a parallel in history would probably be the American cowboy, because I grew up watching westerns. I don't know if anybody else did, any of you guys, but you've got this image of the American cowboy standing out there in the middle of the street and doing his or her fast draw, right? Which almost never actually happened, because most people in the American West were not stupid enough to go stand out in the middle of a road and let some dude shoot at them, right? Um, so it almost never happened. Tombstone is a rare exception. The fight at the OK Corral, where something like that kind of actually happened. Um, and then just the idea of the great American cowboy going out again and rescuing people in distress and stuff. Usually they were just dirty and sweaty and herding cows, but we've got this image. We've created this image around them. One of the professors at UNG Dahlonega, his name is Lev Butz. He actually just finished writing a fictional series, a trilogy, I believe, called Guns of the Wasteland. And what he did with it, and it's actually the first time anybody's ever done it, which is why he said, he was kind of surprised. He was like, somebody should write this. And he was like, what? Nobody's written this? I'm the first one. But he wrote this trilogy of westerns based on the King Arthur story. So it's like the King Arthur story from the Middle Ages with King Arthur and all his knights, and it's retold as a western, because really, the American cowboy is the medieval knight. It's just the American version. All right, so just some thoughts for you there. So, switching veins here, I'm going to bring you another Shakespeare passage, and this one is, it's kind of dark and moody, and but it is, and so I was kind of like, it's not kind of the livelier, perkier thing that most of us would probably want at this period, because of just the coronavirus running around and everybody holed up at home. And yet, some of us are like, no, I like thinking about more serious things in times like this. Either way, this is, what I'm going to read here, maybe the most famous Shakespeare passage. Certainly Hamlet is Shakespeare's greatest play, and this is the most famous passage from Hamlet. And so I want to read this to you and just talk about it. So, this is Hamlet. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There is the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would these fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. And you're like, what the heck did he just read, right? So this is the main character Hamlet is just in despair. Basically, his father dies mysteriously, and then his father's ghost comes back to tell him that his uncle actually poisoned his father while he was asleep, dropped poison into his ear and killed him, and then his uncle married his mother, and Hamlet is the only one who knows all this, and his father's ghost told him he wants Hamlet to take revenge on his uncle. And Hamlet is he's going crazy because he's like, well, what do I, he doesn't know how to pull all this off or what to do. And so in this particular speech, he's reflecting, to be or not to be. That's the question. In other words, Hamlet's question is, to kill myself or not to kill myself, to go on living or not to go on living. That's the question I'm trying to decide here. Is it nobler? Like, is it a better thing to just suffer life's blows, to suffer through life's blows, the slings and arrows of fortune, of fate, right? Or is it better to take up arms, to take up weapons and to oppose fate by taking your own life, so is it better to just suffer, to be beat down by life, or is it better to stand up and say, no, I won't suffer anymore, and to courageously take your own life? This is Hamlet's question, better to die and to sleep, to not exist anymore. Would that be better, right? And by putting yourself to sleep, by dying, to end all this stuff, to end all the heartache, to end the 1,000 natural shocks, all the awful, tough stuff that happens in life. If you just put an end to it, you wouldn't have to deal with that anymore, right? And he says, boy, that would be nice. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. Consummation is like an ending, a finishing point, right? That would be, that does have a certain appeal, Hamlet says, to just end my life and not have to suffer any more of the random stuff life throws at me. There's the rub, he says, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. He's like, what if death isn't just everyth's over, you're done, there's nothing more? What if death is really like sleeping, i.e., you have a spirit? What if your spirit is still alive after death? And he says, there's the rub. That's the problem, right? For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. He's like, what if I take my life and it's not all over? What if there's something even scarier, even darker after death? What dreams will my spirit have after I end my physical life, right? And that's what makes him hesitate. He's like, if I took my life, I wouldn't have to suffer life anymore, all the random stuff it throws at me. But what's after death? That's kind of frightening too. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. He goes on to say, who would put up with all the whips of life, with the way life whips you, with the way that bad leaders like of your country oppress you, right? Who would put up with all the oppression from bad leadership, from bad governments, things like that? Who would put up with, like going to court and trying to get justice and not getting justice, and being put off and put off and put off by people that should help you when you're trying to get justice for yourself, right? Uh, who would put up with all this when you could just make an end with a bare bodkin? A bodkin is a knife. You could just stick a knife in. Uh, who would grunt and sweat under life if they could just end it? Except for the dread of something after death. Except that there's also the fear of what comes after death. The undiscovered country, he calls it. The next life, the undiscovered country, that he's afraid of in this passage. Nobody returns from that country. Nobody comes back, and he's like, this makes us put up with what we've got rather than go into what we don't know, what we can't see, right? And so he says, thus, ultimately my thoughts about that, my not knowing what comes after this life makes a coward of me here, that I'm unwilling to take up arms. I'm unwilling to step out bravely and say, no, life, I won't suffer under fate anymore. I'll show you. I'll take my own life, right? And so ultimately he's like, I don't take action. I continue to suffer, the slings and arrows of fate, what life throws at me. And so this is heavy stuff, right? And for for a person of, and just speaking personally for a person of faith, I personally feel like I know what's after death, but even knowing that, even feeling like I know that, it still, makes me a little nervous because, kind of, I believe in heaven, but it's like there's still so many uncertainties there. And yet it's odd too, because again, just speaking personally, because of my faith in God, my faith in what's after death, I really don't feel in this life like I'm just under the thumb of fate, like everything is despair. I feel like even if bad things happen, there is hope because God is there, and I can look to him and I can pray to him, and I don't despair because I believe that he is there, right? That he's watching over me. I read a quote one time where it said that despair is when we put our sense of certainty, our sense of, oh, this is the way things are and it's terrible, we put that over our belief in God's creativity. We can only see the awful stuff in front of us, and we ignore the fact that God is creative, that God can step in and work even where it just seems so obvious to us that there's no hope, and so again, like I said, that's just me coming at this from my personal perspective. But these are interesting questions. Like, how do you, whether you have faith or you don't have faith, in something outside of this life, what do you do with the suffering that we come across in this life? And what do you do with random chance things that happen, right? Maybe it's a little bit harder for us to understand this. As many of us, not all of us, I don't know your personal background, but being privileged Americans, and especially, that, in a lot of the world, and there are people here in America too, who, some of us, we think, well, life's not that bad. I don't feel like I'm suffering too much. I kind of like it. But for a huge percentage of the population of the world, it does feel like Hamlet says, like you're constantly being hit with slings and arrows of fate, and what do you do, you know? Uh, how do you react to this? And some people are like, I just want to end it. I want to end life. And others are like, no, I've got something outside that I'm looking to that I believe in, and that gives me hope, and courage. Um, there's an interesting poem. If you want an atheist's perspective on this, there's a really famous poem, actually, 20th century poem. It's called Aubade, Aubade. It's by a guy, Philip Larkin, Philiplarkin. It's not a super happy poem, but it is an interesting perspective from an atheist on this question, and so again, Abe by Philip Larkin. Yeah. All right. So talking about more serious stuff here with Shakespeare, but if any of you have, I mean, if this strikes a chord, or you're like, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this topic, on what Shakespeare is digging into and dealing with here with his character Hamlet. So do, if you have any interesting thoughts or want to put your personal perspective in there, please do, drop a comment in under the video. All right. All right. Catch you later. See you Thursday.